The last thing my husband said before they wheeled him into the operating room wasn't, "I love you." It was, "Clara, if anything goes wrong, let Yvonne explain everything." Then the doors swung shut, and I was left standing alone in a hallway at Hamilton General, 63 years old, holding his glasses in my hands because he had forgotten to take them off. My name is Clara Morrison. I have been married to Edmund Morrison for 38 years. We met in the autumn of 1987 at a library book sale. He was buying a history of the Trans-Canada Highway, and I was working the cash table. He paid with exact change. I remember thinking, this man has never been late for anything in his life. I was right. In 38 years, Edmund was late exactly twice. Once for our daughter's university graduation, because he stopped to help a stranger with a flat tire on the 403. And once for our anniversary dinner, because he thought it was a Tuesday when it was actually a Wednesday. What I am telling you is that Edmund Morrison was the kind of man you trust completely. Not because he asked you to, because he earned it one ordinary day at a time for nearly 4 decades. And yet, Yvonne, Edmund's younger sister, had been the one shadow in our marriage from the very beginning. Where Edmund was steady, Yvonne was restless. Where Edmund thought before speaking, Yvonne said whatever came to mind and sorted out the damage afterward. She had moved through a string of jobs: bookkeeping, insurance, real estate, a brief and chaotic attempt at running a catering business out of her apartment in Ancaster, and she had never quite found solid footing. Every few years, she would need something. A loan she would repay by spring. A place to stay for just 2 weeks that stretched into 2 months. A favor that started small and ended complicated. Edmund never complained. "She's my sister." That was always the end of the conversation. I tried to be patient. I truly did. But after 30 years of watching Yvonne drift in and out of our lives, leaving small messes behind her, patience had worn down to something thinner. A tolerance, maybe. Polite, careful, barely enough. Which is why, when Edmund whispered her name in that hospital corridor before surgery, my first feeling, and I am ashamed to admit this, was not confusion. It was suspicion. What has she done now? The surgery lasted 6 hours. A blocked artery, serious but survivable. The cardiologist called it fortunate timing. I sat in the waiting room with bad coffee and a magazine I never opened, turning the same 4 words over and over. Let Yvonne explain everything. Yvonne arrived at the hospital before noon. She brought a paper cup of tea I hadn't asked for and sat beside me without being invited. She asked about the surgery in a low voice. She looked genuinely frightened. I told myself that was easy to fake. "He'll be all right," I said. "I know he will." She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "He's always been the strongest one." Something in that sentence bothered me, not the words themselves. The weight behind them, as though she was referring to a quality she had relied on in ways I didn't yet understand. I didn't ask what she meant, not then. 3 days after surgery, Edmund was stable but sedated for rest. I drove home that Tuesday morning to find our insurance papers for the hospital billing department. Edmund handled all our financial documents. He kept them organized in a green plastic folder in the filing cabinet in the basement. I had never needed to find them myself in 38 years. I had never needed to. The basement smelled like cedar and old newspaper, the way it always had. Edmund's workbench ran along the far wall, neat rows of tools, labeled jars of nails and screws, the small radio he listened to while doing repairs on Sunday afternoons. I went through every drawer of the filing cabinet twice. Tax returns, RRSP statements, property records, car registrations, no insurance papers. I remembered then that Edmund had mentioned something last spring about moving the important documents into the fireproof box. In case of a fire, he'd said. He had a gray metal lockbox that he kept on the shelf above the workbench. I dragged over a step stool and reached for it. The box was not locked. The lid lifted easily. I assumed Edmund had simply forgotten. That was unlike him, but he had been under pressure at work lately. I found the insurance folder almost immediately. I should have taken it and gone back to the hospital. Instead, a second folder at the bottom of the box caught my attention. No label on it, just a rubber band. I opened it. A bank statement, our joint account, a transfer I didn't recognize, recipient, Hartley Education Trust. Amount $2,400. Edmund and I discussed every large expense. A $2,400 transfer to something called the Hartley Education Trust was not something I would have forgotten. There were dozens of statements. I spread them across the workbench. Some went back nearly 20 years. The amounts varied, $800, $1,500, $3,200, but the recipient was always the same. Hartley Education Trust, and mixed in among them every few months, a transfer to Yvonne Bellar. Her maiden name, which she had started using again after her second marriage ended. My hands went cold. I did the arithmetic in my head. 20 years, thousands and thousands of dollars. To Yvonne and to a trust I had never heard of. We had postponed replacing the back deck twice. We had taken fewer trips than we'd planned. I had assumed Edmund was simply cautious, saving carefully the way he always did. Now I stood in the basement under a 40-watt bulb and wondered how many of those decisions had another reason entirely. At the very bottom of the folder was an envelope. My name on the front in Edmund's handwriting, just Clara, and beneath it, in smaller letters, "If you find this before I've had the chance." Before he'd had the chance to what? The paper was soft at the edges in the way of something kept for a long time. This wasn't a recent letter. Edmund had written this and held on to it, hoping, or perhaps dreading, the day I might need it. My hands were shaking when I opened it. "My dearest Clara, if you're reading this without me beside you, then something happened before I could find the words myself. I have tried to find those words for a long time. I am not certain I would ever have found them on my own. What I need you to understand first is that everything I did because I believed it was right. I may have been wrong to decide for you, but I was not wrong about what mattered. For 20 years I have carried a responsibility I never told you about, not because I stopped trusting you, because I could not bear to watch you carry it too. There was one night, November, 21 years ago, when everything changed. I have never told you the full truth of what happened that night. Yvonne has carried half of this weight alongside me. She did not ask to. I gave her no choice. There is a young man named Sebastian Hartley. He was 16 years old when..." The sentence ended there, mid-thought almost, when I turned the page over. Blank. I checked inside the envelope again. Nothing. The letter stopped at the most important sentence it had ever tried to tell me. Yvonne was at my front door by 4 o'clock that afternoon. She carried 2 containers of soup from the deli on Lock Street and a loaf of rye bread. And she looked at my face the moment I opened the door and knew immediately that something had happened. "You found something," she said, not a question. I stepped back and let her inside. We sat at the kitchen table. I placed the bank statements between us. I placed the unfinished letter on top. Yvonne looked at the papers for a long time without speaking. 20 years, I said. "I know." "Transfers to your account. A trust I've never heard of." I kept my voice level. I had practiced being level on the drive home. "Tell me what Hartley Education Trust is." She pressed her lips together. "Clara." "Don't." I put my hand flat on the table. "Please do not tell me you can't talk about it." "I promised Edmund." "Edmund is in a hospital bed." My voice cracked on the last word. I hadn't meant it to. "He said your name before they took him into surgery. He said let Yvonne explain. So explain." She looked at the ceiling. I watched her jaw tighten and release. When she looked back, her eyes were wet. "I can't tell you everything." The frustration that rose in me was almost physical. "Then tell me something true." A long pause, then barely above a whisper. "I never kept that money." I stared at her. "Whatever you're thinking, I never kept a single dollar of it." "Then where did it go?" She shook her head. "I can't tell you where, but I can tell you it never stayed with me." I stood up. "Then you should leave." She didn't argue. She gathered her coat and at the door, she paused with her hand on the frame, not turning around. "I know you have every reason to hate me right now. I'm not asking you not to. I'm only asking you to wait a little longer before you make up your mind about what kind of man your husband is." Then she was gone. I sat alone in the kitchen until dark. The soup containers sat unopened on the counter. I called Natalie Fournier the next morning. Edmund and I had used Natalie's firm in Westdale for over 15 years, estate planning, wills, property matters. She was thorough, warm and direct. I told her about the box. I told her about the statements. I told her about the letter. There was a pause on the line that told me she already knew. "I'd like you to come in," she said carefully. When I sat across from her desk an hour later, she folded her hands the way lawyers do when they are choosing every word. "Edmund authorized me to share certain information if he became unable to do so himself." She slid a thin folder across the desk. "This is what I can tell you." A single typed page. 21 years ago, Yvonne Bellard was involved in a serious traffic accident on Highway 6 during a winter storm. A man named Paul Hartley was killed. His son, Sebastian Hartley, then 16 years of age, sustained injuries requiring extensive medical care and rehabilitation. Edmund was present at the scene. He made a decision, voluntarily, without legal compulsion, to ensure that Sebastian Hartley would have support for as long as it was needed. All arrangements were made privately and are fully legal. I read it twice. "Yvonne was driving," I said. Natalie met my eyes and didn't look away. "Yes." "And Edmund," he covered for her. She was quiet for a moment. "He took responsibility." Whether that's the same thing is something only Edmund can answer. I closed the folder. The money went to Sebastian Hartley. Through a trust, yes. Yvonne administered it. She also contributed consistently for over a decade. I thought of every year I had watched Yvonne struggle. Every time I had silently judged her for being irresponsible, never quite getting her footing, and all along she had been quietly sending what she had to a young man who lost his father because of her. "Does Sebastian know where the money came from?" "He does," Natalie said. I drove home in a silence I don't know how to describe. Not peaceful, not angry, something in between that doesn't have a name yet. Sebastian Hartley called me 4 days later. He said Natalie had mentioned I might have questions. His voice was calm and careful, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this kind of conversation in his head many times. We met at a coffee shop near McMaster. He was 37 years old. He came in with a slight favoring of his left leg, an old injury I would learn. He looked nothing like what I had imagined. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't broken in the way I expected. He shook my hand and looked at me directly and said, "Thank you for agreeing to meet." He told me about the night of the accident, a snowstorm. The highway at dusk. His father had been bringing him home from a hockey practice in Brantford. They never made it. He told me about waking up in a hospital room to find a stranger, Edmund, sitting in the chair beside him. Not because anyone had asked him to, just because Edmund felt he ought to be there. "He visited every week for the first year," Sebastian said. "He brought books. He asked about my courses when I went back to school. He came to my convocation." A brief pause. He sat in the back. I don't think he wanted to intrude. My throat tightened. "Did you ever blame him?" I asked, "or Yvonne?" "I blamed her for a long time." "Yes." He looked out the window at the street. "But anger takes a lot of energy to maintain, and Edmund made it very hard to stay angry. He never asked for forgiveness. He never made it about himself. He just kept showing up." I thought of Edmund buying a history book at a library sale, paying with exact change, stopping on the 403 to help a stranger. Of course he kept showing up. "The trust," I said, "the money." "I stopped taking it about 7 years ago." Sebastian looked faintly embarrassed. "I'm a physiotherapist now in Dundas. I have a family, a good life." He met my eyes. Edmund refused to close the trust. So we compromised. The money stays invested and funds rehabilitation bursaries for young people recovering from serious injuries. A quiet smile. "It was his idea." I was still for a moment. "He never told me any of this." Sebastian nodded slowly. "I know. He talked about that. He said every year he thought, this will be the summer I tell her, and then the summer would pass." He looked at me with something like regret. He was afraid you'd see him differently. I looked down at my coffee. Would I have? I thought about it honestly. Sitting in that coffee shop with a stranger who had known parts of my husband I had never been allowed to see. In the beginning, maybe I would have needed time. Maybe the hurt would have been real. But differently? No, I would have loved the same man. I just would have loved more of him. Yvonne came the evening I got home from meeting Sebastian. She knocked twice quietly. I opened the door before she could knock a third time. She was holding several folded pages, Her hand was trembling slightly. "I took them," she said. "The morning before Edmund went into surgery, he asked me to. He said he wasn't ready yet. He wanted to tell you himself." She held the pages out. "I should have given these to you sooner. I'm sorry, Clara." We sat at the kitchen table. I read the missing pages aloud, because it seemed wrong to read Edmund's words alone. The rest of the letter explained the night of the accident, Yvonne at the wheel, Edmund in the passenger seat, a wall of snow and another car appearing too fast to avoid, the unimaginable seconds that followed. It explained the choice Edmund made when the police arrived and why he had made it, and why he had never stopped believing it had been right even 21 years later. "I am not writing this to ask for your forgiveness," the letter said near the end. "I am writing it because you deserve to know the whole truth of the man you married. I hope when you know it, you will see that the part of me that loved you was never hidden. That part was always yours. Only the burden was kept separate, and I kept it separate because I could not stand the thought of it becoming yours too. I love you, Clara, every ordinary day of it. Edmund." Yvonne and I sat without speaking for a long time after I finished. "Finally," she said quietly, "for 20 years I have been sorry, not just about Paul Hartley, about you. About what I cost you without you ever knowing what it was costing." I looked at her across the table. This woman I had kept at arm's length for 38 years, who had seemed so careless, so unreliable, who had been quietly and invisibly paying a debt for 2 decades. "You should have told me," I said. "I know. I could have helped carry it." She looked away. "That's exactly what Edmund was afraid of." I thought about that for a long while. Then, I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. Edmund came home 6 weeks later. The doctors called it remarkable progress. I called it stubbornness. The first evening, he sat in his armchair by the window, and I brought us both tea. He looked at me carefully, the way he had since waking up. Always checking, the way you check something you almost lost. "You know," he said, not a question. "Everything," I said. He nodded once slowly. "I'm sorry, Clara." "I know. I should have trusted you with it." "Yes." I sat down across from him. "You should have. I was strong enough." He looked at me for a long moment. "I know that now." "You always knew it," I said. "You were just afraid." He didn't argue. After 38 years, he had learned when I was right. We sat together until the streetlights came on outside. He told me things he hadn't written in the letter. The color of the waiting room at Hamilton General the night after the accident, the way Sebastian at 16 had asked him if he played chess, the first time Yvonne had mailed her own contribution to the trust, without being asked, without telling Edmund she was going to do it. "She's stronger than you ever gave her credit for," Edmund said. "I'm starting to see that," I said. The following Sunday, Yvonne came for dinner. She brought a bottle of Ontario Red and a look of cautious uncertainty I recognized. It was the same look she had worn 38 years ago, the first time she'd met me at a family gathering in Burlington, wanting to be liked and not quite sure she deserved to be. I took the wine and held the door open wide. "Come in," I said. "We've been waiting." She stepped inside. Edmund looked up from the kitchen table and smiled at his sister. The real kind, the kind he kept for people who had earned it over a very long time. Some things once broken mend differently than before. Not weaker, just different. You can feel the place where the break was, but if you run your hand along it carefully, you find it holds. That turned out to be enough. That turned out to be more than enough.